Good evening, everyone. This is Jean-Paul Spagnolo, and this evening I'm excited to present to you my institutional case study, and I'm going to focus on the University of Michigan in a time frame of 1967 and 68 called the End of Hours. To begin, we'll start with the history of the University of Michigan. It was established in 1817. The original place it was established was Detroit. However, shortly afterwards, it was moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where it resides today. And the mission of the university is as follows. The mission of the University of Michigan is to serve the people of Michigan and the world through preeminence in creating, communicating, preserving, and applying knowledge, art, and academic values, and in developing leaders and citizens who will challenge the present and enrich the future. And I'd like to kind of focus at that last part of this particular mission statement and remind you of it towards the end of the presentation, that one of the things that the University of Michigan prides itself on is developing leaders and citizens who challenge the present and enrich the future. So the focus again of this point in time in the University of Michigan for this case study is 1967 and 68, also known as the End of Hours. This is a time frame when the rules of sex-segregated dorm life came tumbling down and students entered into a new era of freedom. In order to put a framework into this a little bit, it's also important to think about the history which we've already drawn from our work with Rudolph. And one of the points of the early time frame in the colonial colleges was the thought of in loco parentis. In loco parentis, or also known as the doctrine of in loco parentis, provided that a college had the right to step into the place of a student's life, acting as parents, enforcing academic and non-academic codes of conduct. And we know that it comes clear back to the very beginning of the American tradition of college housing in the United States. One of the quotes that we have come across in our book was from Henry Dunster, the early president of Harvard. And he stated, "You shall take care to advance in all learning, divine and humane, each and every student, who is or will be entrusted to your tutelage according to their several abilities, and especially to take care that their conduct and manners be honorable and without blame." And so really early on in our American history of higher education, this idea and concept of in loco parentis was very important. It meant that as students were attending school, the faculty and administrators were there to help live in with them and also take care of them, not just in their academic, but also in their personal codes of conduct. And that was very important, not just in that time frame, but went through a long history and tradition. And you'll see that as we even see that it was still in place at the University of Michigan clear up into the late 60s. So to discuss the time and place setting of what happened at the end of hours, we need to kind of look at what was going on in America at the time. One of the things that was happening is that World War II had just ended a decade ago, and the GI Bills were making sure that students were having an opportunity to go to school that had been enlisted. And of course, this created a dramatic increase in enrollments, and consequently, the housing at these different universities boomed as well. Also at the same time frame, the Title IV Housing Act of 1950 came about, and that actually provided federal funding that universities needed to kind of increase the housing that they had on campus and started to create large-scale building projects. And that's definitely a piece of what happened at the University of Michigan as well, as they increased their housing during that time frame. Then also the civil rights movement was happening as we move into the 60s, and the students began to challenge institutional disciplinary action, not just in the area of housing, but in all fronts as well. And then after that, of course, another place where students also got highly engaged on campus was the result of the Vietnam War, as traditional attempts to control student behavior were met with rebellion and protest. So at the University of Michigan, sex-segregated dorm life was really a part of the time frame, and there were several rules. The ones that were most challenged by students were the late minutes rules, where there were penalties for breaking curfew, for staying out late even minutes after time frame. They also had this concept of open opens, which was the only time frame when people from the opposite sex were allowed to visit dorm rooms. And they even had a feet on the floor rule, which was kind of an interesting rule. It was that if two people of the opposite gender were in the same room, 3 feet must be touching in the floor at all times. As you see in the picture below, that clearly wasn't the case with these two individuals, so they would have been in violation of the rules at the time at the University of Michigan. And then there was a curfew for women that was very strongly opposed by the students. Interestingly, there was not a curfew for men at the same time, but there were curfews on when the opposite sex could visit each other's living spaces. So, to talk about the University of Michigan end of hours timeline, there's some things that are important of note that happened leading up to 1967 and 68. In 1952, for example, the Prescott and Tyler houses in the East Quad were open to women for the first time, and it was due because of the way that the enrollment was shaping up and what they could provide in terms of housing at the time. So they did have some form of a way of opening that up so that it was actually a co-ed house for a time frame. However, I had a hard time finding any research saying exactly how they divided the room and how the rules applied in that time frame of 1952. It also happened again in 1954, and similarly, they had, again, too many students to be able to handle with the housing options they were able to offer at the time. And so that house in the West Quad was also changed into a co-ed style living. And again, I'm not positive on what they had done in terms of the rules. I couldn't find anything that pointed to those things other than the initial document that mentioned these two points in time of actually having co-ed life in a couple of different dorm rooms prior to the change in the official rules. Then in 1962, things started to continue to heat up as students, as we were talking about the time-place setting, and surveys of students revealed that 2/3 of all students would request co-ed housing if it was even available. Also at this time frame, curfews were abolished, not for every woman, but for the senior women at the university at that time frame. Then in 1965, another change happened and a shift towards the end of hours, and that's when curfews were abolished for junior women. In 1966, there was a moment when the director of the South Quad allowed residents to close their doors during opposite sex visiting hours, and that was a pretty dramatic moment. It also was one of the things that drove and led the change. As a result of these type of things happening on campus, there were several committees that were reviewing and discussing housing and some of the rules of in loco parentis in relation to it, and that led us into what happened at the time frame of 1967. In 1967, they decided that the student judiciary would no longer adjudicate cases involving alcohol in dorms. In addition, the Markley houses dropped the late minutes penalty. Markley houses were one of the dorm homes on campus. Then on November 13th, the Frederick House voted internally to allow 24-hour visitation for a 2-week trial period. That led into December when the Residence Hall Governing Board voted to allow all dormitory houses to set their own rules on visitation for 1 term. And then as this continued to heat up and it went through the Christmas break, they came back, and in 1968, in January, the Board of Regents, as a result of all this stuff that was happening on campus and some of the committees that were meeting together, held a public hearing, and they issued a new campus-wide edict that was to end the hours and rules associated with hours and visitation at the University of Michigan. There was a time frame, though, as they were doing this, in that time where there were a lot of different ideals that were going back and forth, and people were preparing to fight at this time. Bruce Kahn was the president of the student government, and he, quote, said, "Power lies in numbers. If you demand and amass your rights, the university will be able to prosecute you." So he was at this time trying to rile his students, but wanted to make sure that the university was going to change what was happening as a result of students rallying together in relation to these hours and the curfews placed upon students. Also, the housing mothers were preparing for this battle, and one of them was quoted as saying, "Ethics, morals, practically everything has lowered somewhat in the last 5 years." And it was one of those moments in time again where they were concerned about what would be the future of it. So these things happened, and eventually those regents did make that choice to, at least for one term, give an opportunity for every house to make its own rules regarding hours. As a result of this time frame, the president at the time, in 1968, in response to the regents, said, quote, "We know a great deal more about methods of injecting information into students than we do about how to make them civilized human beings." And I found this quote particularly interesting because the president at that point in time was kind of reinforcing some of what was going on in relation to the feelings that people were experiencing because of the rules that they had in place for students that were beyond the academic realm. And again, as you see this thing, you see this concept of in loco parentis fading away, specifically as the hours were attached and the rules in relation to segregation of dorm rooms and sex segregation started to diminish at this point in time. Now, the regents did go ahead and move that forward, but there was a catch. The one catch was this: for a girl to have no hours, her parent would have to give written permission. Then, in that semester coming up, that fall semester after the regents had declared this opportunity for people to have 24-hour visitation and a change of the policy on how people could visit the opposite sex, there was 1,734 freshman women, 1,457 that were given permission by their parents. So clearly, at this point in time, the student's perspective and even the parents were now looking at the university different and the college different, and didn't see the university needing to have the same types of responsibility over watching over their children in a way that they did back in the early days of the colonial colleges leading up clear until this point in time of 1967 and 1968. So this moved into some new beginnings. However, as it changed, because the regents did give permission to each hall to determine its own policy, not every hall immediately adopted the 24/7 visitation policy. However, it did happen very quickly after that. Within the next 2 years, that those things did change. Also, on men's floors, it was widely noted that noise decreased and civility increased when women were present. And that comes from one of the University of Michigan reports that they have on the state of the university in their archives. And then within a couple of years, there was no limits on visitation and no curfews in any of the dorms, as well as you started to see other rules changing and shifting. The house mother era soon ended. However, RAs did remain on campus at the university, and there were still rules in residence halls, but now they were aligned with new theories of campus life and not that of in loco parentis. So they started moving forward in the way that they started to see these rules. So the University of Michigan residence life today is very robust. There is a residence hall association, and that association is combined of students. It does have other individuals that help represent the university when they are in the policy-making process, but they are charged with helping and changing and shifting policies in relation to resident hall life. They now offer things like diversity education, housing student conflict resolution circles, which is a way that they now deal with conflict in today as things change and as they continue to meet the demands of society now. They also have Michigan Learning Communities, which is a place that they try to continue to improve learning communities on campus. RAs are still live-in, and they do live in the different dorms and other housing options on campus. And they are now focusing on sustainability and green living options, which are topics of the day in residence life at the University of Michigan. Also, one of the things that I took up from one of the articles that I was reading is that two large Midwestern universities in 2006 and 2007 had a survey, and this is the kind of results that came out of it. Out of 91,450 students reported, a total of 10 students requested gender-specific housing in 2006 and 2007, representing about 0.01 request rate at these universities for gender-specific housing. So clearly, as you can see, today's society looks at this concept very differently, but as late as 1967 and 68, big, large universities such as the University of Michigan were still living in loco parentis. As that shifted and changed, you now see today the resident co-ed life that we see. And with that, these are the references that I have for my presentation. Thank you for your time.